The Clown Mask, a terrifying horror story. One hot summer, three young men, James, Jack, and Michael, were on the lookout for part-time work to earn a bit of extra money. After some searching, they landed a job cleaning out an old, forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of town. What seemed like an uneventful task was about to spiral into a nightmare none of them would ever forget. The warehouse was ancient, its stone walls cracked and covered in grime, while dust and debris were scattered across the floor. The place felt abandoned, cold, and eerily quiet. Despite the odd atmosphere, the three young men worked enthusiastically, eager to finish and enjoy the rest of their summer. As they sifted through the clutter, James discovered a strange wooden box buried beneath layers of old newspapers and broken furniture. Intrigued, he called over Jack and Michael to open it together. Gathering around the box, they cautiously pried it open, only to reveal something even more unsettling. A grotesque clown mask. Its eyes were small, round, and lifeless, like two black marbles. Its red nose was swollen and misshapen, and its mouth twisted into an unnatural, wide grin. The colors had faded with time, but it was still a chilling sight. Jack, always the prankster, picked it up and said with a laugh, "What if I look like a real crazy clown in this thing?" James and Michael chuckled, not thinking much of it. But when Jack placed the mask on his face, something unnatural occurred. At first, Jack let out a nervous laugh and danced around playfully, but then his behavior changed. His movements grew wild and erratic, as though he had no control over his body. He began hopping up and down, flailing his arms with abandon. His laughter echoed off the cold, stone walls of the warehouse, becoming more unsettling with every passing second. James and Michael watched, amused at first, but then their smiles faded as Jack's movements became increasingly uncontrollable. His body twitched, jerked, and contorted into grotesque shapes, as if the mask was forcing him to act in strange, inhuman ways. He stumbled, fell to the floor, only to spring back up and continue his manic, frenzied dance. It was as if he had lost all sense of self. His eyes were wide open, but there was no trace of the Jack they knew, only a blank, disturbing stare. As time passed, the situation escalated. Jack's laughter turned into a manic, crazed cackle, his movements more erratic and painful-looking. James and Michael began to feel a deep sense of dread. Something was terribly wrong. They tried calling out to Jack, trying to stop him, but it was as if he couldn't hear them. He continued slamming his head against the floor, laughing uncontrollably, his body contorting in ways that seemed impossible. In sheer panic, James and Michael managed to tackle Jack to the ground, pinning him long enough to remove the mask. What they saw next made their blood run cold. Jack's face had been horribly deformed, twisted, bloated, and covered in blood that was pouring from his eyes, nose, and mouth. His features were unrecognizable, his once familiar face now an obscene, grotesque version of itself. His skin was stretched tight, as if something was trying to tear its way out from beneath. Horrified, James immediately dialed for an ambulance, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. Jack had died from the extreme trauma to his face. His body was cold, and his eyes remained wide open in a final, agonizing expression of terror. The warehouse, once filled with the laughter and excitement of three young friends, was now consumed with an oppressive silence. After Jack's death, rumors about the mask began to circulate. The police could find no answers, and the mask itself was never found. Some claimed that it had a curse, a malevolent power that took control of anyone foolish enough to wear it. The few who knew about it whispered that the mask was not just a prop, but a vessel for something dark, something ancient and evil. No one knew where it came from or who had created it, but everyone agreed on one thing. Once you put it on, you would never be the same again. James and Michael tried to move on, but the memory of what happened haunted them every day. They couldn't escape the image of Jack's face, twisted and bloodied, nor the terrible, echoing laughter that seemed to ring in their ears even in their quietest moments. Every night, as they tried to sleep, they would see Jack's eyes in their dreams, wide, empty, and filled with terror. And then, Months later, they started to notice something even more unsettling. The mask was gone, and its dark presence lingered. Sometimes, when they passed by the warehouse, they could almost hear Jack's cackling laughter in the distance, drifting on the wind. Others said that the mask was waiting for its next victim, that it had a mind of its own, seeking out those who dared to take it on. James and Michael never spoke of the mask again, but they knew it was out there, somewhere waiting. And once you wore it, there was no escape. The curse of the clown mask was real, and for those who dared to wear it, the only thing left was the dark, twisted grip of the evil that followed. The warehouse, once a place of work and memories, would forever be known as the place where the clown mask claimed its first victim, and no one would ever dare enter it again. The Desert Trap, a horror tale. It was a late afternoon when I found myself driving through the vast, empty stretch of the California desert, headed toward New Mexico. The air was thick with heat, the sun a relentless ball of fire hanging in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked, dusty earth. I had been driving for hours and was desperate to get off the main highway for a while. The heat was unbearable, and I thought a detour might be just what I needed. So, I took an unfamiliar shortcut, a narrow road that promised to cut through the barren wilderness. The locals had whispered about strange happenings out here, rumors of rituals and strange cults that thrived in the desolation. But I figured they were just stories, just tall tales to spook the tourists. The road ahead seemed endless, no signs of civilization in sight. The wind had picked up, sending gusts of dust swirling around my truck, and soon, the sun began to dip below the horizon. Twilight was creeping in. The desert had a way of shifting from oppressive heat to a chilling coldness as night fell. I was just entering a narrow canyon, where tall grasses and thick bushes lined the sides of the road. The place felt isolated, almost forgotten. It was eerie, like the world had forgotten about this stretch of land. As I drove further, my headlights cutting through the growing darkness, something caught my eye in the distance. Something unnatural. I slowed down, my grip tightening on the wheel. In the middle of the road, blocking my path, was an old, rusted pickup truck. Its engine was off, and the driver's side door was wide open. I could see the broken taillights flickering faintly in the distance, like a warning. As I got closer, my heart began to race. On the ground, there were suitcases scattered across the road, their contents spilled out into the dirt. Clothes, papers, personal items. At first glance, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just a random accident, some travelers who had broken down. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Two bodies lying face down, motionless, sprawled in the middle of the road. A man and a woman. Their bodies were still, their clothes torn, and blood had pooled around their heads, staining the dry earth beneath them. The scene felt wrong. It wasn't just the bodies. It was the way everything seemed so perfectly arranged. Too perfect. The truck, the suitcases, the bodies, all of it looked staged. It felt like a scene from a nightmare that I hadn't fully woken up from yet. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't just drive away without knowing what had happened. I slowly stopped the truck about 100 feet from the wreckage. My hands were shaking as I reached behind me and grabbed my rifle. I loaded it slowly, my mind racing. I wasn't going to get out of the truck. Not yet. Not until I knew for sure what was going on. The silence around me felt suffocating. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the wind rustling through the brush. I scanned the area, trying to see if there was any movement. The bodies remained motionless, their twisted forms hauntingly still. The truck sat like a silent sentinel in the middle of the road, its windows dark. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my breath shallow. Something was off. This didn't look like an accident. It felt deliberate, like someone had set up a trap. But for what? For whom? My pulse quickened. I looked at the bodies again, and this time, my eyes locked onto something I hadn't noticed before. The man's arm was twitching, a faint, almost imperceptible movement, but enough to send a jolt of fear down my spine. I wasn't imagining it. I felt my heart skip a beat. The woman's hand, which had been lying limp, moved too. Not much, just a small twitch, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I realized with horror that they weren't dead. Not yet. The idea of getting out of the truck to check, to help, felt like the worst mistake I could make. This could all be a setup, a way to lure someone into the open. I didn't want to be the fool who walked straight into a trap. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I slowly began to roll the truck forward, maneuvering around the wreckage and the bodies, careful not to get too close. I drove past, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, my foot heavy on the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the road, my heart racing. I pushed the pedal harder, urging the truck to go faster, hoping that the further I got, the safer I would feel. But then, something made me glance in the rearview mirror again. I froze. The two bodies had risen. The man and woman were standing, their arms hanging limply at their sides. They weren't moving like normal people. Their motions were stiff, like puppets on strings. They swayed slightly, as if they were trying to regain balance after being knocked unconscious. And then, from the shadows of the tall grasses on either side of the road, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them, at least 20 people, maybe more. They were dressed in tattered clothes, their faces blank, hollow-eyed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These people weren't just travelers. They weren't victims of a random accident. They were waiting for me. A cold sweat covered my skin. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the engine roaring as I pushed the truck to its limit. I didn't dare look back again. The figures in the rearview mirror were too terrifying to face. I sped down the road, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. I couldn't get out of here fast enough. The sound of my tires screeching on the pavement filled my ears as I finally reached the highway, the familiar hum of the road offering a small sense of relief. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me, following me. I never stopped until I reached the nearest town, and I didn't look back once. But I knew one thing for sure. Those figures, those hollow-eyed people, they were waiting. And sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones with sharp teeth or claws. Sometimes they're the ones that look like us. The ones that smile like you, walk like you, but are waiting to drag you into their world. That world is the one you never want to enter. The Black Cat and the Girl, a tale of unseen horrors. When I was about 10 or 11, something strange happened that I would never forget. It was a quiet night, the kind where the world outside feels as if it's holding its breath. I was in my room, tucked beneath the covers, when suddenly the door to my room, one that I was sure I had closed tightly, creaked open. Startled, I turned toward it, my heart skipping a beat. At first, I thought it was just a draft or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, a black cat appeared. It slinked in from the shadows, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness, the fur on its back sleek and shiny. The creature moved with an eerie grace, as if it wasn't quite touching the ground, as though it was floating. It climbed up the walls of my room, jumping and twirling around the furniture, as though it were dancing to some haunting, unheard melody. I watched, frozen, unable to move or even scream. My eyes couldn't leave the cat's sleek form as it danced around, its movements so fluid, so deliberate, almost like a ritual. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, a little girl, no older than me, stepped into the room. She was dressed entirely in black, her clothes blending seamlessly into the shadows. She moved toward the cat, bending down to pet it, her fingers caressing the cat's fur gently, almost lovingly. Then, in an instant, she scooped up the creature and vanished out the door, leaving nothing behind but a lingering sense of unease. This strange visitation wasn't a one-time event. Over the next few weeks, it happened again and again. The cat would come, dance its eerie dance around the room, and then the girl would appear, lift the cat, and disappear just as mysteriously as she had arrived. Each time, I would be left with a strange chill in the air and a gnawing feeling that something was not quite right. As the days passed, I grew older and I began to notice a pattern. The girl, despite the passing years, never seemed to age. Her appearance remained unchanged, as though she was stuck in time, while I continued to grow. The cat, too, never grew any older. It remained as it was, sleek and dark, its movements graceful, its eyes always glowing in the dim light of my room. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind. But the encounters only grew more frequent and disturbing. Eventually, I couldn't pretend any longer. One evening, I decided I would confront the girl. I had waited for her visit, watching as the cat slinked into my room once more. I had made up my mind. I would talk to her. I approached the cat, carefully reaching out a hand to stroke its soft, black fur. But as soon as my fingers were just inches away, the cat darted away, leaping out the open window with an agility that was almost unnatural. Before I could react, the girl appeared, stepping into my room like a shadow. She saw the cat was gone, but then she turned to look at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and what I saw there sent a shiver down my spine. Her eyes, which had once been a soft shade of pale blue, were now glowing a deep, blood red. The light from them seemed to pulse, drawing me in, unable to look away. It wasn't a fiery red, like the embers of a flame, but a cold, almost otherworldly hue. It was a red so deep, so intense, that it felt like it was consuming my very soul. I tried to move, to look away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, my body stiff as if every muscle had been frozen in place. The girl began to approach, step by slow step, her presence like a weight in the room, suffocating the air. The cat, now perched on the windowsill, stared at her with unblinking eyes, as if it were watching her every move. Desperate, I tried to grab something, anything, to protect myself. My hand found a nearby stick, a small wooden rod. I swung it at her, desperate to break free of the trance her eyes had cast over me. But as I swung the stick, she vanished into the air, her form disappearing as if she had never been there at all. The cat, however, didn't vanish. It remained perched on the windowsill, its eyes now fixed on me, as though waiting. It jumped down from the ledge and padded silently across the floor toward the door. I was left trembling, my heart racing. For a long moment, I just stood there, not daring to move, not knowing what to do. From that night on, the girl stopped coming. The cat, however, returned every evening, just as it had before. Each time, I would wake up moments before it arrived, my senses alert, knowing that it was almost time for its eerie dance. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. The cat would dance, and I would watch in horror as its graceful movements twisted my mind, making me feel as though I were losing my grip on reality. Then, one night, something happened. The cat, once again, danced in front of me. But this time, it didn't disappear when I reached out to it. Instead, it stayed, staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. I hesitated, my hand hovering over its fur. But before I could touch it, the girl appeared again. She stood in the doorway, her red eyes glowing brighter than ever. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a grin that stretched unnaturally across her face, as if something was wrong, something deeply wrong with her. I felt the air grow colder, and I could feel the room closing in around me. Then, she took a step forward, and everything went black. The next thing I knew, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. I thought it was all just a dream, but when I looked around, I saw the cat's footprints on the floor, leading toward the window. It was gone, but I knew it would be back, and so would she. From that moment, I no longer saw her, but I could feel her presence. Always in the corner of my room, always watching, always waiting. And the cat? It still comes. Every night, it dances its eerie dance, but I never try to touch it again. Because I know now, the girl is still there, just beyond the shadows, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And when I do, I won't escape. The Blind Man and the Mysterious Girl. Ethan had never seen the world in color. Darkness was his constant companion. He navigated through life with his other senses, his hands and ears guiding him, while his dog Max was his loyal protector. Ethan lived in a small, quiet apartment at the edge of town. His world was defined by silence, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps or the wind brushing against the windows. One day, as Ethan sat on a park bench, the familiar chirps of birds filling the air, he felt an unusual presence. The usual noise of the park, laughter, chatter, and the hum of traffic, seemed to fade away, leaving only a profound stillness. Ethan turned his head instinctively, feeling something or someone near. He tensed. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, the faint scent of lavender. Then, a voice, a gentle, almost melodic tone, reached his ears. "Is it lonely, living in the dark?" Ethan froze, unsure of the question's meaning. He knew no one was around, at least no one within reach of his senses. But the voice was close, and there was something eerily familiar about it. A pause. Then the voice spoke again, almost as if it were floating in the air around him. "Sometimes, it must feel like you're missing out on so much." Ethan didn't answer right away. He had learned to ignore his moments of loneliness, the ones where he felt an ache deep inside, a longing to see what the world looked like. Instead, he sat in silence, the air around him still and heavy. The footsteps moved closer. There was a slight rustling, and Ethan felt an inexplicable shift in the air. A shadow crossed over him. "Who are you?" Ethan thought he heard himself say, but it felt like the words came from somewhere deep inside him. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, as if waiting, as if watching him, and in that moment, the air grew even colder. Days passed, but the girl never returned. Ethan's life continued as before, quiet and uneventful. Yet, every evening as he sat in his small apartment, reading or listening to music, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It wasn't until one night, as a storm raged outside, that he felt her presence again. The wind howled against the window, rattling the glass. Max lay quietly beside him, as if sensing the shift in the air. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the knock came, soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. Ethan stood up, his pulse quickening. He made his way to the door, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. Slowly, he turned the knob. The moment the door creaked open, he felt her Lucia, standing just beyond the threshold. Her scent was the first thing he noticed, faint but distinct, like lavender mixed with something darker, something ancient. She stood in the rain, her clothes soaked, her eyes glowing faintly, even in the dark. "Come inside," Ethan found himself saying, his voice sounding distant, as though he were no longer in control of his own body. Lucia stepped in, dripping wet, her presence filling the room with an unexplainable heaviness. She moved silently, almost like a shadow. Max, usually protective, didn't bark. Instead, he stayed still, his fur bristling slightly as if sensing something otherworldly about her. Lucia didn't speak, at least not at first. She simply moved closer to the window, her gaze fixed on the night outside. Ethan watched her, but every time he tried to focus on her, his senses seemed to blur. There was something about her, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to sink deep into Ethan's bones. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. Something in her words unsettled him. There was an intensity in the air that he couldn't explain. Her voice wasn't just heard. It was felt, like a wave crashing over him, pulling him under. The room was colder now, colder than it had ever been. Ethan took a step back, instinctively reaching for Max, but the dog didn't move. Lucia, as though sensing his hesitation, turned toward him, her eyes locking onto his. "You feel it, don't you?" she whispered. "The pull, the need to see, to know more, to be more." Ethan felt a tremor run through him. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he realized that he hadn't only wanted to see the world. He had wanted to understand it, to grasp it with more than his senses. But as he took another step back, a strange sense of dread filled him. What was she? What did she mean by all of this? Lucia stepped forward, her movements fluid, almost inhuman. "I've been watching you," she continued, her voice now a low hum in the stillness of the room. "For so long, waiting for the right moment. And now, Ethan, it's time for you to make a choice." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Lucia's eyes glowed brighter now, a deep, unnatural shade of blue that sent a shock through his chest. He could feel it, a presence not of this world, something ancient and powerful. She reached out, her hand brushing his cheek, cold as ice. "You can see the world, Ethan," she whispered. "All you have to do is let go. Let go of your blindness. Let go of this life." The words filled Ethan's mind like a tidal wave. The idea of finally witnessing the world he had always wondered about was intoxicating. But at what cost? Lucia's grip on his hand tightened, and for a moment, Ethan felt a surge of something, fear or perhaps longing. It was impossible to tell. The air around them thickened, as if time itself was slowing down. But just as suddenly as it had begun, Lucia pulled away. "Not yet," she said, her voice now distant, fading. Ethan stood frozen, his heart racing. The room returned to silence. Lucia was gone. The rain continued to fall outside, but everything felt different now. Darker, heavier. The choice had been presented, but what was the right one? Ethan sat back down, his hands trembling. The world outside still remained a mystery, but now, he knew there was more to it than he could ever understand, more than he could ever see. And Lucia? She was always near, always watching. The choice was his to make. The mysterious tenants. Sarah and David were a young couple, newly married and eager to start their life together. They found a charming little cottage on the outskirts of town, nestled between dense woods and rolling hills. The rent was surprisingly cheap, and the landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, seemed kind enough. He lived in the house next door with his wife, Mrs. Whitaker, both of whom were known to be reclusive and quiet, but warm-hearted. The cottage they rented was quaint, with ivy climbing up the sides and a small garden in the front. The sun always seemed to set in the most beautiful way, casting a golden glow across the fields behind the house. Everything about the place felt perfect, almost too perfect. As the days passed, Sarah and David grew accustomed to the peaceful rhythm of their new life. They would wake up early to the sound of birds singing, spend the day working or enjoying the serene surroundings, and retire to the warmth of their cozy little home at night. They would occasionally wave to Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker as they sat on their porch, but the elderly couple rarely left the house. Everything seemed ordinary, until one evening when Sarah noticed something strange. She was sitting by the window, sipping tea, when she saw two figures walk across the Whitakers' front yard. The figures, a man and a woman, were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with dark, somber faces. They moved quietly, almost as if they were gliding across the grass, and then disappeared into the house. Curious but not overly concerned, Sarah asked David about it when he returned home. He shrugged, saying that it was probably just someone visiting the Whitakers, perhaps distant relatives. But Sarah couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in her mind. She tried to dismiss it, convincing herself it was just her imagination. The following week, Sarah and David had dinner with the Whitakers. The couple was warm and welcoming, their house cozy and filled with old furniture and heirlooms. As they ate, the conversation turned to the history of the house and the land. Mr. Whitaker told them that the house had been in his family for generations, passed down through the years. But his tone grew somber when he spoke of the old tenants who had once lived there before him. "They were good people, those who came before us," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice low and tinged with sadness. "But something happened to them. It was never quite right, and they never left." Sarah and David exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what Mr. Whitaker meant. But the conversation quickly shifted to lighter topics, and they thought little of it. A few days later, however, things began to take a strange turn. At night, Sarah began hearing soft whispers coming from the Whitakers' house. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the voices seemed to grow louder, more distinct, like murmurs of conversation. She would sit in her living room, staring at the wall, trying to ignore it, but the whispers persisted. Sometimes, she would even hear faint footsteps, as though someone was walking through the house at odd hours of the night. David noticed the odd behavior too, but he chalked it up to the old house settling, a natural occurrence with age. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. One evening, Sarah decided to go over to the Whitakers' house to ask about the strange noises. As she approached the door, she was stopped in her tracks by the sight of the two figures from the yard, the man and the woman, standing silently in the front window, staring out at her. Their faces were hollow, their eyes vacant, and their expressions filled with deep sorrow. They seemed to be waiting for something. Someone. Terrified, Sarah backed away and ran back to her cottage, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, she couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder, now echoing in her mind, and she kept seeing the figures of the man and woman, standing in the window, waiting. The next morning, she went to the Whitakers' house to speak to them. Mr. Whitaker was sitting on the porch, looking as though he hadn't slept a wink. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mr. Whitaker," Sarah said cautiously, "I need to ask you about those two people. The ones I saw in your window the other night. Who are they?" Mr. Whitaker's face darkened, and he motioned for her to sit beside him. "They were my parents," he said quietly. "They were the last ones to live in this house before us. They were good people, but they were trapped here by something we didn't understand. They died in this house many years ago, but they never left. I've seen them too, Sarah. They've been here for so long, lost in time. They never got to say goodbye." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She suddenly realized that the whispers she had been hearing, the footsteps, the figures in the window, they were not just memories. They were trapped souls, lost in the world of the living, never able to find peace. As she sat there, the air seemed to grow heavier, and Sarah could almost hear the faint sound of the footsteps again, the whispers echoing through the walls of the house. The Whitakers' home had become a tomb for the souls of the past, never able to move on, their regrets and sorrow lingering like a thick fog. "I've tried everything," Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice breaking, "but they don't want to leave. They can't. Their regrets, they keep them here." Sarah and David tried to help. They spoke with spiritual leaders, tried prayers, rituals, but nothing seemed to work. Every night, the figures returned to the window, and the whispers continued. The spirits of the Whitakers' parents, trapped in the house by their unspoken regrets, were never at peace. And as the days went by, Sarah and David began to understand something chilling. They had come to this house, thinking it was just a peaceful little cottage in the countryside. But now, they realized that they weren't the only ones living there. The house had once belonged to the Whitakers' ancestors, and their unresolved grief had bound them to the land, trapping them in a cycle of endless sorrow. The spirits had never left. They had only been waiting, and as Sarah and David lay in bed at night, they too could hear the whispers, the footsteps, the calls of those who had stayed behind. In the end, they too became part of the house's story, adding their own grief to the weight of the memories that lingered. The house was not just a place to live. It was a place to remember, to regret, to mourn. And the souls who couldn't leave were always there, watching, waiting, always waiting. The alien watch. Tom was a quiet man, living in a small town where everyone knew each other's business. His life had always been simple. He worked a 9-to-5 job at a local factory, had a modest home, and a loving wife, Sarah. They had 2 children, Mark and Emily, and although their life was ordinary, there was always a sense of peace in their small suburban world. One evening, as Tom was returning home from work, something strange happened that would change his life, and his family's life, forever. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something unusual near the front door. There was a small, glowing object lying on the porch, its surface reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, a peculiar metallic shape that seemed to pulse with a faint light. Tom, curious but cautious, approached the object. As he bent down to inspect it, he realized it was some kind of watch. The design was unlike any watch he had ever encountered. It was made of a smooth, almost liquid-like metal, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The watch seemed to hum softly, almost as though it were alive, its pulsating glow rhythmically matching Tom's heartbeat. He picked it up, unsure of what to make of it. The watch felt warm in his hand, as though it had been resting there for hours, waiting for him. The strange symbols on the watch seemed to shift and change as he stared at them, as if they were communicating with him. Tom didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming urge to wear it. When he went inside, he showed the watch to Sarah. She was as baffled as he was but didn't think much of it, believing it was just some odd piece of junk left behind by someone. Tom, however, couldn't shake the strange feeling he had about the watch. Something deep inside him told him that it wasn't just a random object. It was important. It was meant for him. He carefully fastened the watch to his wrist. As soon as the metal clasp clicked into place, he felt a sudden surge of energy, as though the watch had connected with his very being. A strange warmth spread through his body, and his senses seemed to sharpen. Colors around him appeared more vivid, sounds clearer, and even the air felt different, more vibrant, alive. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual, and life continued as usual. But over the next few days, things began to change. Tom's dreams became more vivid, as though he were living in two realities at once. He began to see strange images in the corners of his vision, like flashes of distant stars, swirling galaxies, and unfamiliar landscapes. It was as though the watch had opened a door to another world, a world that Tom couldn't quite comprehend. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt a strange pressure on his chest. The watch began to hum louder, and before he knew it, his surroundings began to warp. He wasn't in his bedroom anymore. He was somewhere else. A vast, open space filled with swirling lights and distant stars. He looked around in disbelief. This wasn't just a dream. He was standing in a place far beyond Earth, in a realm where time and space seemed to bend and fold upon themselves. In the distance, a figure approached. A tall being, its body composed of shimmering, translucent light. Its face was obscured, but Tom felt a strange sense of calm wash over him as it drew nearer. The being spoke, its voice a harmonious blend of sounds that echoed in Tom's mind. "You have been chosen." Tom's heart raced. Chosen for what? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The being continued, "This watch is a gift. It will help you see the world as it truly is. But with this gift comes great responsibility." Before Tom could process what was happening, the being reached out and touched the watch on his wrist. A flood of images filled his mind, visions of otherworldly landscapes, civilizations far beyond his comprehension, and beings who had lived for eons, observing Earth from afar. It was overwhelming, and Tom's mind struggled to make sense of it all. The being's voice echoed again. "You are a bridge between worlds, Tom. The time will come when you must choose how to use this gift. Do not take it lightly." Suddenly, everything went black, and Tom found himself back in his bedroom, drenched in sweat. He gasped for breath, heart pounding. The watch on his wrist was still there, pulsing with its familiar hum. For the next few days, Tom's life became a strange blur. He saw things he couldn't explain. He felt a connection to the universe, as if he was no longer bound by the limitations of time and space. He could see into the future, glimpse moments that hadn't yet happened. But along with these gifts came strange disturbances. Disturbing visions of destruction, chaos, and alien landscapes that seemed to call out to him. Tom tried to ignore the overwhelming sense of unease that was growing inside him. He didn't understand the full meaning of the being's message. Why had he been chosen? What responsibility did he have? And what would happen when the time came to make a decision? One evening, as he sat at the dinner table with Sarah and the kids, a flash of light erupted from the watch. The room filled with a buzzing sound, and the walls seemed to ripple as if reality itself was beginning to fracture. Tom looked up in panic, but Sarah and the kids seemed oblivious, their faces frozen in calm, peaceful expressions. It was then that Tom realized the true nature of the watch. It wasn't just a piece of alien technology. It was a connection to something much bigger, something beyond comprehension. And as he stared at the watch, its symbols glowing brighter, he understood. The universe was watching him. Time was running out. The watch would soon call upon him again, and this time he would have to make a choice. A choice that would determine not only his future but the future of the entire planet. The weight of the universe rested on his shoulders, and he had no idea what was to come. But one thing was certain. The watch had chosen him, and there was no turning back.